financial information. School districts also face many threats that could result in an unauthorized person accessing that confidential data. That includes things like data breaches, phishing scams, or ransomware attacks. These kinds of attacks on school districts have increased in recent years. In March of 2021, the K-12 Cybersecurity Resource Center reported an 18% increase in IT security incidences in school districts over 2020. Further, a 2020 Government Accountability Office report found that large and affluent school districts were had disproportionately more reported data breaches than smaller districts. So although school districts maintain sensitive data, Kansas districts are not required to implement any specific IT controls. State and federal laws restrict who has access to student data. The Federal Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA, requires written permission from a guardian before a district can release information from a student's education record. The Kansas Student Data Privacy Act also restricts who districts and the Department of Education who can release student data to, but neither law requires districts to implement any specific IT controls to prevent unauthorized access to those records. There are also state laws that require state agencies to adopt certain IT security controls, but those laws do not apply to school districts. Further, the Department of Education does not require districts to implement any specific controls. So districts have requirements to protect data, but no requirements as to how to protect that data. So the more detailed answer to the question starts on page 3. We sent surveys to all 286 school districts and to the Kansas Schools for the Deaf and the Blind. We asked districts to report on the practices their districts have currently implemented across several IT security control areas. 51% of the districts responded. Given that relatively high response rate, we think that the results are reasonably representative of districts statewide. Districts, as I mentioned before, that districts are not required to implement any specific IT controls, but there are good basic controls that are just good practices for school districts out there. And we looked at those kind of good basic controls and asked districts whether or not they had implemented those. And the majority of the school districts reported lacking several of those basic security controls. The figure on page 4 shows more details. The figure on our website provides the full answers to all the questions that we asked in the survey, but the hard copy only shows a selection of them. But as you can see on that figure on page 4, 58% do not require security awareness training for their staff at any time. Standards suggest that staff should attend security awareness training when they're hired and then again annually. 59% of districts said they do not require confidential data to be encrypted when sending it outside of the district's networks. All confidential data should be encrypted every time it is sent outside the network. 65% do not scan their computer systems for vulnerabilities as often as standards suggest. That included 35% of districts that reported never scanning their computer network. Standards suggest that organizations scan their networks at least monthly. And 69% of districts told us they do not have an incident response plan. Without a plan, the risks are much greater that an organization cannot recognize or respond to a security incident quickly or effectively. Further, we found that small school districts, so school districts with 500 kids or less, lag behind larger districts in implementing some security measures. A large district is a district with 3,000 or more students. So 67% of small districts reported having antivirus installed on all the district's computers, but 80% of large districts did. Additionally, 33% of small districts reported scanning computers at least monthly, but in comparison, 55% of the large districts did. We also asked districts to rate the significance of various barriers to implementing adequate IT security controls, and that figure is on page 5. As you can see in that figure, staff-related issues were the most significant barriers. About half of the districts reported that their ability to hire sufficient IT staff or to pay them competitively were significant barriers. Districts also reported other difficulties in the survey. Several reported that the lack of guidance from the state was problematic. And a few also reported that it was difficult to get staff to implement security practices because they were considered inconvenient. We also interviewed several stakeholders, including the Department of Education, a service center, a private company that provides IT services to districts, and several school districts. Every person that we talked to reported that a lack of knowledge or training was a challenge that they faced. Most of them also reported that guidance from the state would help them better implement IT security controls, although some of them thought that imposing requirements would likely be met with some resistance. We also asked districts to estimate their IT security expenditures. On average, districts reported spending about $18 per student. In comparison, districts spent on average a total of over $16,000 per student. We looked for national benchmarks for IT security expenditures in school districts to compare Kansas districts to, but we couldn't find any. So as a result, we can't say whether the expenditure estimates districts provided us are reasonable or not. We should note here, though, that the federal government provided additional funding to school districts to offset expenditures related to COVID-19. You probably are aware of that funding. It's ESSER funding. And the federal government does allow districts to use that funding for certain IT security activities. Our last findings on page 7. We identified 3 states that require school districts to implement specific IT security controls. Due to some time constraints, we couldn't do a comprehensive search of all states, but we did identify a few that require districts to implement security controls. New Hampshire and New York both require their departments of education to establish minimum IT security standards for their districts to implement. And Texas requires school districts to adopt a cybersecurity policy and also requires districts to designate a cybersecurity coordinator. We made one recommendation out of this audit, and that was to the Kansas Legislature to consider directing the Department of Education to establish a set of minimum IT security standards for school districts in either the form of guidance or requirements. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. And I know I just read the Department of Education's response, and I guess it's not so much a question, but I'm wanting to better understand, because I know that the State Board and the Department of Education have been looking at this issue, and there's people here that maybe could answer the question better in regards to what's currently in place as far as looking at this issue, because I know sometimes there's a little resistance when the legislature proposes legislation. I believe it's possible to deal with this without it. And so maybe I would ask the department to come up and see where we're at right now and how maybe, you know, we can work together with what you guys are already doing. So could you just give us an update based on you guys looking at this issue already, on what's already being done, and maybe especially on how we're encouraging, you guys are encouraging local school districts to put more emphasis on this issue?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the rest of the committee members, my name is Craig Nineswander. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Fiscal and Administrative Services at the State Department of Education. So our response dealt with our IT staff was established to provide support and resources for the department's technology needs, not necessarily for 286 school districts. So in response to this audit, our IT director met with a number of technology directors from school districts who wanted to be involved in helping find a solution for it. So to date, they have developed a best practice security policy template that districts can use to define their best practices. They have developed a cybersecurity guidance and recommendation document that we hope to be able to send out early next week to all districts. That same group of people are developing a training video for school districts to follow, and then they would like to establish and will establish a K-12 technology council for district technology staff. The issue is, you can imagine, 286 districts each have their own technology environment with different types of computers, different hardware, different software. So the approach of having school districts support each other, we think gives us the best chance to be able to address issues with everybody. It's been exciting, I guess is the right word, to see the collaboration that's happened and the district technology directors that stepped up and said, we want to be a part of solving that.
Have you started the process of putting together some minimum standards for all school districts to follow on this issue?
Yes.
Okay. And again,
I was just going to say,
as much as I love proposing legislation,
final draft.
you know, I don't really feel like it's necessary right now, believing that you're doing that. And I think we all agree it needs to be done. And so unless somebody's going to, you know, if Randy wants to come over and ask me to, you know, consider doing that, then you know, we can talk about it. But my hope is that we can do this without us proposing legislation directing, because I think that you're already in the process of doing it. I wanted the committee to be aware and for us to, like I said, coordinate our efforts with you, you know. And I know that the JCIT committee, even a couple years ago, were looking at this issues and including with the schools. And so, again, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And so as a committee, I think we could all agree that we want to encourage and maybe even, you know, towards the end of the session, you know, maybe as we wrap up in March, maybe have a more formal update from you guys in regards to this issue. And again, right now, I have no plans in introducing legislation on this issue. And so let's get an update. You know, I appreciate the update now, but I think a month from now, even as the state board looks at this again, let's continue to shine a light on it and make sure that the local schools are implementing the minimum standards that we want to be met.
Certainly. Be happy to provide an update.
Okay. Yeah, I'll ask Deborah and we'll send out something just kind of getting. And I don't know, last year Randy was on the schedule to speak to the committee and that got canceled. I don't know, I think it was because of snow. So maybe that might be an opportunity for some even on the committee that might haven't had a chance to meet him. So maybe in March we could do something where he could come over and address us on, you know, this issue and maybe a few other topics. So let's try to plan for that. Other questions from the committee? Representative Schreiber for Heidi or anybody? Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, there's two parts, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Proceed.
First, is there mandatory reporting by the school districts to any central repository of security incidents, IT security incidents?
There has not been mandatory reporting. I think the intention here is that through this technology council, we would be able to track where school districts are.
Okay. And the second question is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, the Kansas Fusion Center. It's within the Adjutant General and Attorney General's purview, but they work on cybercrime on public-private partnerships. But I didn't know if that might be a resource for you to check into to see if they might be able to provide some insistence or assistance or insight.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This would be for either one of you. So for those districts that really haven't started on this, have done little or nothing, what would be the cost to provide the minimum amount of security that you think they would need?
That's a good question, and I hope it's a good question because we asked the same thing earlier today, so that's something we're working on. It's probably going to require a little bit of a survey of school districts to find out for sure where they are and how many steps they have to take. So that's a long way of saying I don't have a direct answer for you, but we're going to find out. And we will get that for you when we do.
Representative Thomas.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Estes.
While you're there, page 3, it says you guys didn't feel like you had the staff to oversee, and it kind of begged a question in my mind. Do you feel like inside your department you have enough knowledge in that specific of an area? And if not, have you considered, consultants that could help you, or some of the local universities that have amazing cybersecurity programs. That Friends comes to mind. Friends University comes to mind as a resource maybe for you guys in the districts.
So the answer to both halves of the question, I believe, is yes. We have staff who are specifically tasked with providing security for the agency, cybersecurity, who are pretty knowledgeable, but they regularly rely on outside sources to update their own knowledge. And in fact, I believe they work with I don't know it as the Fusion Center, but I believe they work with them, and I'm sure they're in touch with universities. So yes, I think is the answer to both parts of the question.
Okay. Could you tell me what you know about what kind of financial information a district has on a student on their computers, systems?
Financial information on a student?
Yeah, page
Oh.
2, one of the report says, that school districts maintain a variety of things and financial information is there. And I was wondering what kind of financial information is maintained, if you have a sense of that.
Financial information would be free and reduced lunch applications. That's the extent of it.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Stockstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed it says in here that there was 408 publicly disclosed incidents related to data breaches, ransomware, and phishing attacks. Have there been any successful ransomware attacks in any of our school districts that you know of?
Yes.
Really? Okay.
A few.
Few?
Over several years' time that I'm aware of.
Okay. What are some of the other types of breaches? Is there anything as particular there they seem to be looking for, or?
Well, I think Heidi touched on it, because school districts keep data, and what I have read, data on young students is valuable because that potentially could be of use to somebody with bad intentions for years down the road.
Okay.
So I believe that's probably the primary issue. We do not keep Social Security numbers specifically, never have. So that information they cannot get from us. But you all know better than I do. Some of them are pretty good with what information they might be able to get, and they don't know that till they break in and see what's there.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Poskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a follow-up to the financial data that might be held on computers and district systems, would that include payment and bank information for online lunch payment, online fees, and so forth?
I don't know enough about how the technology works to know if they could get directly from a computer system into the credit card account. But I want to say no, but I can't swear to that.
Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't see HIPAA mentioned anywhere in this report, and so if you're storing medical and mental health information, I just want to make sure what is in place as far as HIPAA protections for the students, just in case there's some sort of hack or misinformation.
And I try to be careful not to say everybody, so I'll say typically the school nurse has access to that information and nobody else. So within their own database systems, they limit which staff members can have access, for instance, to free and reduced lunch applications, which staff members can have access to medical information. And then if there is a need to know in a classroom, the school nurse will deliver that to the teacher.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. So if security is breached and anything were to be hacked, what are there protections in place, correct? Like any sort of, I just want to make sure schools aren't getting in trouble and there's HIPAA protections in place.
Yes, there are protections in place. I'll just stop there, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Representative Byers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we have any idea of how many school districts are still using antiquated servers, or are we all pretty much on modern systems and moved up to where we can easily implement these types of protections we need?
Short answer at the moment from me is no. We may have staff members that know much better than I do, probably do actually, but I couldn't tell you how many. I will say with COVID, and it was mentioned ESSER funds being available to help with technology if it was COVID related. So a number of districts, when they had to close and go to remote learning, needed to upgrade their their technology systems so they could support that many laptops going home. They also were able to update security a little bit at that time, but that's not the same level of security that I think we're talking about here. So the number of antiquated servers and so forth is probably less than it was before COVID, but I'm sure there's still a number, and that's going to depend on your definition of antiquated as well.
Thank you.
I think Representative Thomas thought he might have a little bit of information too.
Yeah, and on the ESSER funds, a lot of these districts, when they went remote and had to update their technology, they're still withdrawing down those funds. So we'll know more at the end of '24 when those funds are no longer available, who was able to use that money to update their technology. It's absolutely one of the 15 uses of it. So we'll see kind of as we move along who uses that money.
Further, Representative Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To hire people to do that, and thank you, Mr. Sanders, for asking that question. The cost, of course, is an interest, but is that something that can be paid out of capital outlay funds, salaries for someone like that, or does that have to come directly from the general fund?
As a general rule, that's going to be your general fund or your local option budget. Capital outlay salaries can be paid to those who are maintaining the facility, so maintenance workers and custodians, but not necessarily those that are maintaining hardware or software or cybersecurity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Estes.
I wanted to follow up on Representative Thomas's question because your answer kind of made me think about IEPs, and often a school nurse submits some medical information to IEPs. So would IEP information have the same protection that medical records do, and in the limitations and so on? And or if you guys could just give that some thought.
Okay. Short answer is yes. They have the same type of protection because they have medical records in addition to the fact that it's a lot of personally identifiable information about that student's individual education plan.
Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? I would just, in wrapping up again, if you could pass that on, I think, oh, did somebody else have a question? Representative Sanders, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry. So what percentage of the 280 some odd districts have an IT person?
Everybody will have somebody identified to be your IT person. In a large district, you have a staff that's doing that.
Right.
In our smaller districts, 200 students, it may be a teacher on a supplemental contract.
Okay, so some of the districts do not have somebody specifically just for IT.
I believe that's a fair statement. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And again, I think it would be good, a lot of interest on this topic, and I'm sure for you guys too. You know, I don't know if you've got your agendas set at the state board for March, but you know, I do think for you guys to put together more information on where you're at and what your plans are, maybe in your March meeting, and then I would love to maybe set up a meeting with Randy and then have you guys come back after turnaround. So that give us some time to, you know, again, I don't want to propose legislation unless you guys want me to, and I doubt that's the case. So I think this has been a good discussion, and I'm glad we were able to have Heidi here. Heidi, I'm sure you're very disappointed that you didn't get more questions directed to you, but maybe next time. So thank you, committee, for your attendance next week. Again, I know we have the deaf and blind hearing, and I know we have a few bills to work, but I didn't want to get into working bills today. We'll deal with working bills next week. Thank you for being here, and with that, committee, we are adjourned.